The doctors walked past him like he was part
We
of
had
the
to make some
furniture,
incredibly
and
difficult
he was
decisions.
carrying a child's
I am
lunchbox in one
sorry,
hand
but your
and a
position has been
trauma chart in the
eliminated.
other. He didn't know that the woman stepping off the elevator in the tailored coat had already decided to shut the entire ward down. The monitor flatlined before she reached the nurse's station, and he was already moving, gloves on, calling compressions before the attending even looked up from his phone. Dr. Renata Voss had restructured 4 hospitals in 3 years. She read the room in seconds, minus outdated equipment, overworked staff, a male nurse in scrubs that had been washed so many times, the blue had gone grey. She noted him the way she noted a cracked ceiling tile, functional, replaceable. She asked the charge nurse who he was, and the charge nurse said, "That's Marcus. He's just a floor nurse." Renata wrote something in her portfolio and moved on. Marcus brought the patient back in 4 minutes. Nobody clapped. He peeled off his gloves, checked the time, and went to the break room where a small backpack sat beneath the table. He unzipped it and took out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. He set it on the table and stared at the wall and breathed. That was all. That was enough. Renata's audit revealed what she expected minus budget waste, staffing gaps, one ward running on instinct instead of protocol. She scheduled terminations for Friday. Marcus was 4th on the list. She was in the conference room reviewing files when the charge nurse knocked and said there was a woman in pediatrics asking for him specifically. A mother whose son had coded 3 weeks ago and who brought, for reasons nobody could explain, a dozen cookies in a tin. She says he saved Eli, the nurse said. Renata looked through the glass. The mother was crying, and Marcus was standing with his hands in his pockets and saying almost nothing. Renata turned back to her files. She told herself it didn't matter. On Thursday, she found a manila envelope in the Conti soured. Staff suggestion box addressed to no one, sealed. She almost discarded it. She didn't. Inside was a single document, minus a transfer request, dated 8 years prior, from a department she didn't recognize. The letterhead was government-issued. The signature line was redacted. The name in the request field said Marcus Dale Rock. She set it on her desk and stared at it, and something turned over in her chest that she hadn't felt since her brother's funeral. Friday came. She called him in at noon. He sat across from her with his hands flat on his knees and his eyes level, and he did not appear nervous. She began to explain the restructuring. He nodded once. She paused and said, "You're not going to argue." He said, "Would it change anything?" She looked at the envelope on her desk and said, "There is a document with your name on it that I can't find any record of." He looked at the envelope. He said, "Okay," she said, "that's all you're going to say?" He said, "Yes." She told him he was. Suspended pending review, and he stood. And she watched him pick up that same washed-out jacket from the chair, and she noticed, for the first time, that the left cuff was frayed and had been stitched back together by hand, in a stitch that was too precise for someone who hadn't been trained to work with their hands under pressure. She found him in the hospital garden at 5 o'clock, sitting on a bench with a small girl, maybe 6, who was eating half of that same wax paper sandwich. The girl looked up at Renata with her father's eyes, minus steady, measuring minus, and held out the other half without a word. Renata was going to decline. Instead, she sat down and took it. The bread was plain white. The filling was just turkey. It was the best thing she'd eaten in 4 months, and she didn't know why, and she didn't let herself examine it. The girl said, "Daddy says you're the one who closes things." Renata said, "What does that mean?" The girl said, "He says some people close things and some people open them. He says you can learn to do both." Renata had no answer for that. She ate the rest of the sandwich in silence. She ran the document through 2 federal contacts that weekend. Both calls went to voicemail. On Sunday, a 3rd person called her back and said only, "That name is not one we discuss on open lines," and disconnected. She sat in her apartment with the document in her hands and felt for the first time in years that she was standing on ground she had not properly surveyed. Monday morning she went to find him and was stopped in the parking lot by two men in uniform. Navy. They were polite. They asked for Marcus Dale Rourke by full name and rank, and the rank they used was not one she recognized from any hospital org chart. She told them he had been suspended. They told her, with a respect that made her feel inexplicably small, that his presence was required. She looked up and heard it before she saw it, minus the helicopter descending in the field behind the lot. No. Markings rotors, flattening the grass. Marcus was already walking toward her from the building. He had his jacket on, he'd been told. He always knew before anyone else, she said. You were going to let me fire you. He said, you had the right, she said. What are you? He looked at the helicopter. He said, a dad, a nurse, she said. And before that, he said, somebody else. He looked at her then, just once, and the distance between them was not the 4 feet of parking lot asphalt, minus it was every choice each of them had made to become exactly who they were standing there as. And it was enormous, and it was not impossible. He handed her a folded piece of paper. She looked down, and when she looked up, he was 20 feet away and moving. She opened it. It was a second document, older than the first, with a different signature, fully unredacted. The shape of what she'd been wrong about opened in her chest, like a room she hadn't known existed. She called the hospital board that afternoon and pulled Marcus's name from every termination list. That night she stood in the garden alone where they had sat, the bench empty, the light going sideways through the trees. Her phone buzzed. A text, 4 words, she's asking about you. She put the phone in her pocket and looked at the open gate, and she was already thinking about what she would say when she walked through it, and she hadn't decided yet. But she was still standing there, which meant she hadn't decided to leave either.